For centuries, we've been told one story. The Library of Alexandria held the knowledge of the ancient world. Then came the fire. The library was destroyed. But the historical record tells us something much less certain. Because the real mystery isn't simply who burned it, it's whether one fire destroyed the library at all.
Alexandria was built to become one of the great cities of the ancient Mediterranean. Under the Ptolemies, it became a center of scholarship, where researchers, writers, and intellectuals gathered. Within that world were institutions associated with the Museon and the library. The library became famous for collecting written works from across the ancient world. But there's a problem. We don't know exactly what its main building looked like. We don't have a complete surviving catalog of its collection. And we don't have a reliable record telling us the exact moment it disappeared. That uncertainty matters, because the more closely we examine the evidence, the less simple the famous story becomes.
By 48 BCE, Alexandria was caught in a struggle between Julius Caesar and the forces of Ptolemaic Egypt. The fighting reached the city's harbor. Caesar ordered enemy ships to be burned to prevent them from being used against him. The fire spread beyond the ships and into parts of Alexandria. That much is clear. But the library is where the story becomes complicated. Caesar's own account describes the fighting and the burning ships. It does not clearly say that he destroyed the library. Later writers describe the fire spreading through the city. Some sources mention books being lost. But the famous claim that Caesar's fire destroyed the Great Library comes from a later account. So already, the evidence is not as simple as the legend suggests. There was a major fire. But what exactly did it destroy?
So where does the famous story actually come from? Part of the answer lies in the ancient sources. Seneca, writing in the 1st century, mentions a huge number of books being destroyed in the Alexandrian fire. But he does not simply say that the entire great library disappeared. Then, much later, Plutarch gives the version that would become famous. He writes that the flames spread from the harbor and destroyed the great library. That sounds definitive. But Plutarch was writing generations after Caesar's campaign, and the earlier evidence is not nearly as clear. Some writers describe the ships burning. Some describe the fire spreading through the city. Some mention books being lost. And not every source connects those losses directly to the library. So we can be confident about one thing. Alexandria suffered a serious fire. Books were lost. But the evidence becomes much less certain when we make the much larger claim that one fire destroyed the entire library. And that distinction is crucial.
There is another problem with the simple story. If Caesar's fire destroyed the entire library in 48 BCE, then the institution should effectively disappear from the record. But Alexandria did not stop being a center of scholarship. Its intellectual institutions continued into the Roman period. Strabo, writing after Caesar's campaign, still describes the scholarly world of Alexandria. That does not mean the original collection survived intact. It does not tell us how many scrolls were lost. And it certainly does not prove that nothing important was destroyed. But it does make one thing harder to claim: that every part of the library vanished in a single event. A fire can destroy books without destroying an entire intellectual tradition. And a collection can suffer catastrophic losses without disappearing completely. That distinction changes the question. Instead of asking where the library burned, we should ask what happened to it afterward.
The library is often imagined as one enormous building, packed with scrolls. But ancient Alexandria was more complicated than that. The city's scholarly institutions changed over time.
Rulers changed, political priorities changed, and collections of texts did not necessarily exist in one single place. Books could be copied, collections could be transferred, institutions could lose funding or prestige, buildings could be damaged, and individual groups of texts could disappear without every surviving collection being destroyed at the same moment. That creates a very different possibility. Perhaps the library did not have one dramatic final day. Perhaps what we call the Library of Alexandria was weakened through a much longer process. A fire could remove part of a collection. Political change could reshape the institution. Later destruction could remove something else. And eventually, the original institution could disappear from history without anyone recording one definitive final moment. That would explain why the evidence feels fragmented.
Then, centuries after Caesar's fire, another major destruction took place. Around 391 CE, the Serapeum of Alexandria was destroyed. The destruction of the temple complex is supported by archaeological evidence, and the Serapeum matters because later traditions connected it with Alexandrian books and collections. From there, the story became tempting. Perhaps the library had survived in some form. Perhaps part of the collection had ended up at the Serapeum. And perhaps when the Serapeum was destroyed, the last remains of Alexandria's great library disappeared with it. It is a compelling explanation. But it is still an explanation. The Serapeum was destroyed. That part is historical. What we cannot establish with the same confidence is that this was the final destruction of the Great Library. And that is the pattern we keep encountering. Real fire, real destruction, real losses, but uncertain connections between them. So, which explanation makes the most sense? The first is the famous Caesar theory. The fire certainly happened. Books were lost, and Plutarch later says the Great Library was destroyed. So Caesar's fire may have caused serious damage. But the evidence does not securely prove that everything disappeared that day. The second possibility is gradual decline. The Alexandrian scholarly world changed over generations. Institutions evolved, political conditions changed, and collections could be lost over time. This explanation fits the fragmented record more comfortably. Then there is the possibility of multiple destructive events. Caesar's fire may have been one. Later damage may have caused more losses. The destruction of the Serapeum may have affected another part of Alexandria's intellectual world. But there is a warning here. We cannot simply connect every historical disaster and call the result the destruction of the library. Some connections are supported, others are possible, and some belong more to later tradition than to secure historical evidence. The mystery survives precisely because the evidence refuses to give us one clean answer.
So what can we actually conclude? The Library of Alexandria was real. Alexandria became one of the ancient world's great centers of scholarship. A major fire occurred during Caesar's war in 48 BCE. Ancient sources indicate that books were lost, and a later source explicitly says the Great Library was destroyed. But none of that proves that one fire erased the entire library and all of its accumulated knowledge. The Serapeum was later destroyed as well, but its exact relationship to the final fate of the Great Library remains uncertain. So the strongest conclusion is not a dramatic one. We cannot identify one securely documented moment when the library simply vanished. What we can see instead is a long and complicated history of destruction, survival, institutional change, and loss. The famous single fire story may capture part of that history, but it does not explain all of it.
Maybe that is why the Library of Alexandria still fascinates us. We want history to give us a single moment, a single fire, a single villain, a single explanation. But the evidence refuses to cooperate. Alexandria's collections were lost. Its institutions changed. Buildings were destroyed, and generations came and went. Some of those losses were recorded. Others were not. And over time, a complicated history could become a much simpler legend. One library, one fire, one disappearance. But the truth may have been much slower and much harder to see. The Library of Alexandria did not leave us a final page. It left us a mystery.